Hello, and welcome to the Transportation Planning Capacity Building video series. This video series is sponsored by the Transportation Planning Capacity Building Program, jointly administered by the Federal Highway and Federal Transit Administrations. I'm pleased to introduce Faith Hall, a community planner in the FHWA Office of Human Environment.
Hello, everyone.
The goal of this video is to explain the role that equity should play in the work of a planner at a state DOT, MPO, or transit agency, and how you can best put equity into action. By the end of this video, you will understand how equity is defined within transportation planning, why it's important, and how to consider and institutionalize equity through your planning processes and products. This video does not constitute a standard, specification, or regulation and does not create any requirements other than those stipulated in statute and regulation.
U.S. DOT and FHWA's Non-Discrimination Authority, grounded in a long history of national-level legislation and executive actions, forms the basis for our work in the equity arena. Rather than create a new requirement, U.S. DOT and FHWA are shifting to an equity approach for how we administer existing program requirements.
As you work through this video and learn more about equity at U.S. DOT, you should look to the following resources for more information: the Department of Transportation's Equity Action Plan and Planning-Related Key Performance Indicators, or KPIs. Promising Practices for Meaningful Public Involvement in Transportation Decision-Making. Promising Practices for Advancing Equity in the Transportation Planning Process, which is expected in spring 2024. And the Transportation Planning Capacity Building webpage on equity. We will reference several of these resources in this video. Defining equity in transportation.
When putting equity into action, we first need to understand what is equity and its relationship to transportation planning. Similarly, throughout this video, we will raise questions worth keeping in mind as you embark on your journey to implement equity in your agency's planning process and products that play a foundational role in guiding investment decisions.
Under the 2021 Executive Order 13985, Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities, the term equity means the consistent and systematic fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment. This can include Black, Latino, and Indigenous and Native American persons, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and other persons of color, members of religious minorities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, or LGBTQ+ persons, persons with disabilities, persons who live in rural areas, and persons otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality.
Applying this definition to our work, equity in transportation seeks fairness in mobility and accessibility to meet the needs of all community members. A central goal of transportation is to facilitate social and economic opportunities by providing equitable levels of access to affordable and reliable transportation options based on the needs of the populations being served.
To understand the background and the importance of transportation planners' responsibility for more equitable decision-making, we need to look no further than the build-out of the interstate highway system with the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Construction disproportionately impacted low-income communities and communities of color. In addition to the direct impact of losing homes and businesses, which undermined community cohesion and the accumulation of generational wealth, many communities continue to grapple with a legacy of disparity, pollution exposure, and underinvestment today. In seeking a restorative pathway forward, it is important to note that transportation equity does not mean equal. As you can see in this graphic, each person's unique circumstances influence their ability to ride the same equally sized and shaped bike. In essence, they cannot all benefit from the same solution. An equity-centered approach, on the other hand, as illustrated below, provides solutions that respond to established needs, where everyone can benefit from the transportation improvement. In this case, the joy of riding a bicycle.
When we consider equity at each stage of the planning process, We support and engage all people and communities to improve quality of life and to promote safe, accessible, and multimodal access to opportunities and services while reducing transportation-related disparities, adverse community impacts, and health effects. Ultimately, we reduce inequities across our transportation system and the communities they serve. Done thoughtfully, equitable transportation policy can transform economies, connect people to opportunity, and empower underserved communities to build generational wealth for the future.
Before we discuss how to put equity into action, here are two things to consider. Context is important, but it's not everything. You may be wondering, how does equity apply to my specific context? Equitable transportation decision-making considers the geography, history of a place, and the unique circumstances that impact a community's mobility, accessibility, and connectivity needs. Based on this, how you choose to approach your community may be different, but the overarching goal is the same. There is no wrong way to begin. Ensuring that equity is included throughout the entire planning process can feel like an overwhelming task added to an already busy schedule. Consider where you are in your planning cycle and what activities you have coming up to find a great place to start. Putting equity into action.
In a previous video, we discussed the transportation planning process through a review of the FHWA briefing book, which you can watch on the Transportation Planning Capacity Building site under the Connect and Learn page. In that video, we reviewed how the 7 main steps in the transportation planning process are a guide. They are not set in stone. Those steps are complex, overlapping, and flexible in order to respond to changing circumstances, new demands, and shifting public priorities.
Similarly, the steps involved in incorporating equity into the planning process are not always sequential and need to be just as flexible. Planners need to be creative and use a holistic approach to consider how to weave equity into every step of the planning process. We can think about this approach in 2 big buckets: determining equity priorities and planning for equitable outcomes. Determining equity priorities.
Any good building needs a solid foundation. This process is no different. Establishing equity priorities early on will provide a touch point throughout the transportation decision-making process and project lifecycle.
Who, what, and where are our underserved communities? Addressing equity requires a good understanding of the community you are serving, especially those who may be underserved. You should use a holistic, data-driven, and community-focused approach, including both quantitative and qualitative information to identify these communities.
A quantitative approach may include using tools such as the U.S. Census, EPA's EJ Screen, U.S. DOT's Equitable Transportation Community Explorer, and local demographic surveys, among others. You can also collect and analyze demographic data on the members of the public who provide input to your organization and partners via surveys, meetings, and other methods to confirm if your results are representative of the population you're intending to serve. Use local data and conversations to ground truth your understanding of what the data is telling you. Your agency may also have existing demographic profiles for your region. Review these demographic profiles as you begin to identify underserved communities. It's not enough to identify underserved communities on a map. We must also understand needs and goals through meaningful public involvement. Qualitative approaches include talking to people. This might mean local community-based organizations with well-established connections and deep roots in the area. It could mean nonprofit leaders, focus group discussions with neighbors, and interviews. People are a rich source of information, and they know their communities best.
Have I reached out to the underserved communities I identified, and how have we engaged historically? To ensure that individuals and communities have an equitable voice in transportation decision-making processes, you should work to understand the history of the place and address barriers to meaningful public involvement. Barriers may include internal culture in your organization and thought processes such as, "we've always done it this way," reliance on one-size-fits-all methods, a lack of organizational accountability and follow-up, or weak partnerships with community-based organizations.
Public involvement strategies should involve a combination of in-person, virtual, digital, and print tools in languages spoken by community members, along with intentional and varied outreach methods to ensure that people with disabilities and diverse needs and experiences are aware of and can participate in opportunities to have a meaningful impact on decision-making. Meet with key community leaders, stakeholder representatives, elected and appointed officials, and tribal leaders early to inform ways to engage the general public. You can learn more about the community and vet the goals and scope of the program. Promote transparency and trust by documenting how the community's voice may be reflected in final decisions. Consider creating a group of leadership champions or establishing an equity supportive advisory group. For more information, review DOT's Promising Practices for Meaningful Public Involvement in Transportation Decision-Making Guide.
Do our priorities reflect the community's vision for its future? After both identifying and engaging underserved communities, don't forget to communicate. During the engagement process, you should collect data and notes that you can communicate back to the public for feedback and confirmation to ensure that what you are advancing accurately reflects the goals of the community. This is also important to build trust and accountability.
Previously established local, state, and federal plans in your area may also already have an equity goal set forth that can help to orient your process. Communicate this to the public and incorporate it into your approach. Communicating a leadership commitment to prioritizing equity in a plan or policy is powerful and provides a foundation for equity work in your agency. Priorities that are too broad or irrelevant to the community could lead to unproductive outcomes. More specific goals and policies will need to be backed up with resources, training for staff, and funding to institutionalize them. Equity priorities may shift over time and should be reevaluated regularly.
In practice example, let's take a look at how the Plannersburg MPO is institutionalizing equity. Plannersburg MPO is updating its Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or MTP, to include strategies and actions to address current and future transportation demands in the area. For this update, Plannersburg wants to document existing needs and emphasize equity in their underserved communities through a combination of quantitative and qualitative research. To update community profiles, they first look for trends in data from federal resources like the American Community Survey from the U.S. Census, EJ Screen, and US DOT ETC Explorer. Then, they talk to local community groups to more fully understand trends they see in data.
From the community profiles, planners find that on the west side of Plannersburg, there are many lower-income neighborhoods. The west side of town experiences a significantly higher rate of fatal crashes, especially those involving pedestrians. Staff also realize there are many Spanish-speaking residents who have historically been left out of traditional public engagement.
Based on that information, the Plannersburg MPO revised their public engagement plan for their MTP to consistently provide multilingual engagement options in both written and spoken forms, hire bilingual community ambassadors to support translation work and engage with community members, hold virtual and in-person meetings in accessible locations that include the west side of Plannersburg, share plans and project ideas in a clear, interactive, public-friendly way, including videos and interactive surveys and maps, and collect data on who they are engaging to ensure that they are hearing from an audience that represents the community served.
Plannersburg MPO staff analyzed participant demographics and realized through the data they collected that they did not sufficiently engage their Spanish-speaking population. So they plan to partner with a community-based organization on an annual event that typically has strong attendance from the Spanish-speaking community. There, they will distribute a survey in written and digital formats. Through the first stage of engagement, Plannersburg takes explicit steps to ensure the MTP is linked to the community's vision and priorities and advances overarching equity goals.
Planning for equitable outcomes. You may think that when facing so many proposed projects, it can be difficult to prioritize equity. This is where early consideration of your agency's role in advancing the community's equity priorities comes in. If equity considerations are applied early and carried through the planning, project prioritization, selection, and implementation phases, equity is embedded rather than an extra step.
Adopting a data-driven, community-focused approach to analyzing and considering equity in project prioritization and selection can ensure a transportation agency's approach to equity is systemic.
How does a transportation agency ensure a proposed action contributes to equitable outcomes? Estimating the individual and cumulative impacts of projects is an important activity when developing transportation plans and programs. Keep in mind that decisions at the planning stage are the most powerful for avoiding or minimizing burdens and maximizing benefits before a transportation action moves into project development. These impacts can be expressed in terms of benefits and/or burdens at the individual project level, cumulatively for all proposed projects in a plan or program, and in the short and long terms.
Equity priorities and previously collected community input should inform how you estimate the benefits and burdens of programs and projects. The process can enable more objective decision-making in sometimes complicated political and geographic contexts.
How do we ensure equitable decision-making is built into the system moving forward? Thinking long-term, you should work to institutionalize equity into the decision-making process. Adopting a systematic, data-driven, people-oriented process for prioritizing equity in plan development, project selection in the MTP, and programming in the TIP helps ensure that equity is prioritized at critical stages of the transportation planning process. Without a clear process for evaluating proposed projects on their ability to advance equity goals, you risk relegating equity to an afterthought.
A common approach is to develop a methodology for scoring projects that includes transportation equity. The scoring could be tied to goals, performance measures, or the analysis of benefits and burdens. For example, a project that meets several equity goals might receive extra weight in the scoring to bring it higher in the priority list.
In practice example, let's revisit the Plannersburg MPO's process. Plannersburg's vision for the future of the community serves as a strong foundation to guide their planning process. To ensure that they won't lose sight of the equity goal that is a part of that vision, Plannersburg created an equity working group to advise the planning process and policy direction of planning products, such as the MTP, TIP, the Unified Planning Work Program, Public Involvement Plan, and Coordinated Public Transit Human Services Transportation Plan. Several local leaders from the west side of Plannersburg serve on the Equity Working Group.
For proposed projects, Plannersburg staff conducts an analysis to estimate the short and long-term impacts on the identified underserved communities and ranks projects based on the perceived burden and community benefit.
Historically, Plannersburg has used a data-driven approach for project selection that scored projects on several criteria, but didn't weigh equity concerns. Based on the previous data analysis and public input, Plannersburg created an equity criterion and decided to increase its weight in the project scoring method. Moving forward, planners at the MPO continue to return to their equity priorities to measure their progress. Summary.
Institutionalizing equity into our transportation planning processes and products is critical to our success as planners at a state DOT or MPO in representing the communities we serve in transportation decision-making.
As you start or continue bringing equity into your work, here are some questions we discussed today that you may want to consider. What is equity and its relationship to transportation planning? Who, what, and where are our underserved communities? Have I reached out to the underserved communities I identified, and how have we engaged historically? Do our priorities reflect the community's vision for its future? How does a transportation agency ensure a proposed action contributes to equitable outcomes? How have we sought to understand potential impacts for underserved communities? How does our approach address long-standing needs and provide benefits? What are the long-term impacts? How do we ensure equitable decision-making is built into the system moving forward?
In addition to these questions, it is important to remember you're never done addressing equity. It's not a box to check and move on from. This is an ongoing effort with many opportunities to improve and evolve with experience. Get creative. There are many ways to address equity, and a solution that worked somewhere else may or may not work in your community. And finally, big or small, there's no wrong way to start this important work. Your next staff meeting could be a great place to ask the question.
For more information about this topic, or related equity topics, you can visit the Transportation Planning Capacity Building page on equity and review the following resources: U.S. DOT's Equity Action Plan, Promising Practices for Meaningful Public Involvement in Transportation Decision-Making, and Promising Practices for Advancing Equity in the Transportation Planning Process, which is expected in spring 2024. Please note that except for the statutes and regulations mentioned, the content of this video does not have the force and effect of law and is not meant to bind the public in any way. This video is intended only to provide information and clarity to the public regarding existing requirements under the law or agency policies.